Right. Well, welcome to the International Association of Reading Graduate Students Spring Speaker Series. We are excited to have you with us today. My name is Lacey Bryce, and I am the current president of IARGS, and it's a student organization at the University of Georgia under the advisement of Dr. Jennifer Graff. And our mission is to support student scholarship that focuses on the teaching and learning of reading. So we are very honored to have 4 esteemed scholars as our panel guests this semester, and we really appreciate your support of IARGS this year. So our focus panel, or the focus of our panel this year, is to provide an opportunity for just collaborative conversation focusing on current understandings about the reading process, reading instruction, and reading assessment, particularly within the context of the science of reading. We're looking forward to learning from each of our guests as we just continue to work towards effective and equitable reading instruction and opportunities for students. But before we get started, I would like for each guest to just take a moment to introduce yourself and share a little bit about your current research. And if I don't know if you're seeing the panel like I am, but we could just start with Dr. Nguyen Liu, and then go to Dr. Hatton, and then Dr. Gay, and then Dr. Gabriel. You're at the bottom of my screen, so I'm just going to go in order if that's all right. Okay.
Thank you, Lacey, and thank you for this invitation. My name is Silvia Nogueron Liu. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And part of the research I do now is working on building partnerships with Latinx and bilingual families around multiple literacies at home and in the community, and also thinking together with them about the role of technology in sustaining home languages.
Hi, everyone. I'm Courtney Hatton. I'm an assistant professor at Illinois State University, and my research really centers around helping students sort of leverage their background knowledge as they're reading text and help them make sense of a text based off of what their knowledge and their past experiences have been. My current research is shifting a little bit. I'm interested a little bit more also in vocabulary, since knowledge is often sort of represented by vocabulary. So that's a thing that I think about. And then today you'll hear me talk a little bit about relational reasoning. And that's another sort of avenue of my research. And I can share a little bit more about what that is as we go.
My name is Mary Gay. I'm a clinical associate professor at the University of Georgia. My interests are in early literacy. I'm a clinical staff, so I'm not necessarily doing research per se, but I do run the reading clinic, and I've worked with schools. And so a lot of my work is in basking in how kids are learning to read, and dyslexia lately has certainly been impetus to go even deeper in that thinking.
I'm Rachel Gabriel. I'm an associate professor at the University of Connecticut. And my research has focused on how different policies set and limit what counts as good reading instruction, and create or close down opportunities for diverse learners to learn to read in school settings. I also run our reading clinic, which is much teenier and more periodic than Mary's. And I'm really excited to be here today. So thank you for the invitation again, Lacey.
Yes. All right. We are excited to have each of you here, and thank you again. Also, thank you to our audience members who are here. We have teachers, teacher educators, researchers. So we're excited about the conversation, and we know it's going to be very informative for us. If you are in the audience and you do have questions, we will have opportunities for you to ask those questions. If you will share them in the Q&A box. The chat box will be open, but we ask that you just put your questions in that Q&A box. And as those come up, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we possibly can. So So Dr. Gabriel, I think we'll start off with you. If you don't mind giving us just how you are defining the science of reading and what you are seeing as being most prioritized when researchers and educators and school districts discuss the science of reading.
I think there are multiple versions of what counts as the science of reading floating around. Every time somebody tries to pin one down, it backfires a little bit. That attempt backfires a little bit. It ends up being used as a symbol for several different intersecting ideologies. And depending on who's in the conversation, it may or may not kind of index or include a whole repertoire of ideas that that may not even be intended by the interactants, but it's kind of working right now as a magnet that sucks up a bunch of different possibilities for, again, what counts as good reading instruction and how we know, but also what counts as science and what counts as evidence and what counts as truth. And so you can kind of follow those concentric circles out to being part of a bigger, larger societal question about fake news and truth, about science and evidence, and evidentiary proofs in kind of like civic discourse. And then also just in epistemic differences in you know, old wars like quantitative and qualitative, or large scale, small scale, or does experience tell the truth or tell us lies, or do numbers tell us the truth or tell us lies? So that was a long-winded answer that just means nothing, and that's what I like to do with my professor hat on. But when I take that off and talk to other people outside of academia, there are some sort of shorthands for what science of reading is being used to represent in different circles. And in academic circles, I think the Reading Research Quarterly special issues now, the second one is I think almost completely out, is doing a pretty good job of highlighting the ways that researchers are defining the science of reading in a range of different ways by asking questions about which sciences have information that we need to be paying attention to when we think about letting or think about having research inform practice, and also having practice inform research. And therefore, what sciences or what ways of organizing inquiry should we be paying attention to? And so it's really broad when you talk to researchers. In one step out from research among practitioners, I think there still is an understanding that what different people mean when they say science of reading kind of varies. And there are some somewhat broader possibilities, like science of reading is just sort of the new form of evidence-based. It's just have you use science to inform your understanding of what you're doing. And that is still pretty broad. And that is why among school folks, district folks, and school leaders and teachers, you often see a range of practices that are considered scientific because they are the result of or have been validated by some sort of organized inquiry process, whether that was like a local inquiry process or a published peer-reviewed inquiry process. But in the larger public sphere, so in policymaking conversations in the media and among advocates and organizers, science of reading ends up having much sharper edges and meaning a much narrower thing. In the media, it most often refers to only early literacy, usually K3, and only a focus on what neuroscience has indicated is important, and that even is debatable. So there's the idea that the evidence comes from a hard science, neuroscience usually, biology sometimes, genetics sometimes. I have a little bit of an echo here. Her name is Juliet. She'll just chat like right along with us. She's just agreeing with me. Right. She always agrees with me. So there's the idea that the evidence is coming from those places, but what the evidence is pointing to is that there is a known singular way of teaching reading that is right, and that every other way of teaching reading is wrong. And that known singular way of teaching reading has been known by some communities, but not others, for decades, has been ignored either out of ignorance or will for decades. And that there is a moral imperative and a now increasingly with alliances with the NAACP and with APA and other groups, a social justice imperative to stop ignoring the science, capital T, capital A, capital S. However, when you sit down to write what the science is and isn't in legislation, as policy, so that you can outlaw anything unscientific and in-law anything that is part of the science of reading, it gets really complicated to describe, once again, what fits and what doesn't. And so the kind of colloquial popular understanding is that explicit systematic phonics instruction has been missing and needs to be included, and that arguments against that are reactive, defensive, and uninformed. It can also mean that only certain programs of explicit systematic phonics instruction should be included, but depending on where you are in the country, what gets nominated as having more or less evidence shifts. And so if you do kind of take a 30,000-foot view, you still see the confusion, even among those who are most certain and have the most narrow view. I'm going to stop there with my non-answer. And just leave you sort of with an image that there is a little bit of a funnel shape or an upside down triangle of what counts as the science of reading, with some extremely pointed, sharp, narrow edges among certain communities, and then just sort of wider and wider or broader and broader understandings included, depending on where else you might fall on the spectrum.
Great, thank you. Any other guests want to add?
I think he did a great job of sort of identifying the complexities of the science of reading in the way that we're talking about it. So great job, Rachel.
So maybe let's go and talk a little bit about how we expand this the science of reading conversation to include some of those things that might not already be considered or maybe outside of what we are considering the science, talking about maybe how we can have a more comprehensive view when we talk about the science of reading. What needs to be included in this conversation that maybe is not already being included? And I will let any panel guests really respond to that if you want to.
I can talk about that. This is Sylvia, and I'm just responding as part of this expansive perspective is coming from the group of scholars who have been doing research with emerging bilingual children and children from non-dominant backgrounds, because part of the concern is to think about how there's a body of evidence about the reading process with children who are attending bilingual programs, dual language programs, and also even when children are not in a dual language program, they are immersed in diverse language and literacy practices in their homes and communities. So the question becomes, how can we bring in what we have learned in qualitative studies, in studies in partnership with families and communities about multi-literacies, about the idea of translanguaging, when children use all their linguistic resources together, not in isolation, that I'm only going to speak Spanish, or my expectation to use Spanish or a home language is going to be the academic standard of that language, but I can draw on everything I know together, pulled when I'm reading a text or when I'm responding to an academic task. And I think part of this expansion process, and I'm looking back at the questions you all sent earlier, is helping teachers explore and analyze the affordances, what something can do for you and what it can't, when you analyze your curriculum resources, your assessment procedures, And also more recently, your digital resources, the websites, the apps that we're sending home. And with COVID and the remote learning experience we have a different, I guess, wave of technology use at home. What can it do for you? What can it tell you about what emerging bilingual children know? And what are you missing? What do you need to do to gain more information about what children know? And for that, you need an expansive theory or a lens, like translanguaging is one example, to help you look beyond a narrow scope. But I also think the most important piece, even if you have the theory, if you read the books, if you do the PD, you have to build the relationships with those families so that children know that their linguistic resources are welcome in school. Because we may send a survey, we may send translated materials, but just building the relationships, it's going to be key for families to share with you what home practices, home literacy practices can be part of that bridging school and home practices. And building on what Rachel said about the very narrow focus, my concern is how this narrow focus on English only phonics may do for this relationship building. If what we communicate is that this is the most important thing that a child needs to learn, and those first years, kinder and first grade, that's when many families begin building relationships with schools in this country. So what do we need to do to expand and share what matters, especially in this academic year that's coming, when we hear all these concerns about loss, about gaps, about catching up, when children have been learning at home, and we have to find a way to make that visible in classrooms through assessment that's expensive.
Yeah, I think to figure off a little bit on that too is this idea of like the assessments and things have to be expanded. We need to have assessments and tools that allow us to see more. I think when we're using tools that just allow us to see like what phonics rules weren't followed or why they weren't getting this word wrong from a phonics perspective, just so narrow. And I think it's really problematic because that's not all that kids are doing, that those phonetic things are impacted by syntax. I mean, when you're anticipating in second languages, there's psychologists are doing research on that, how there's extra time, just, bits, but there's extra time when you're syntactically anticipating something that disrupts that phonic work that you're doing. And if it's contextualized in different things, the meaning making that you're doing, the discourses might be different, the topics might be different, that's all there. So I think when we're able to have tools that allow us to see words read incorrectly aren't just phonics, I think that helps us not only see kids, I mean, that then children can feel valued because somebody's seeing my work, because we know that kids are like they have systems that they're using, and those are complex systems whenever they're trying to read and make sense. And so the more we can see, the more we give them credit, and then they say, oh, wow, you realize that my home language has an impact here. You realize that it's just not a digraph or an R-controlled vowel, that it's something bigger than that. And we can help to build strategies for them. Then you've got kids who are going to be more likely to be engaged and become more strategic. So I think a lot of ways, narrow science of reading becomes narrow in this push of, my goodness, if only you were doing explicit systematic phonics. And I think that's dangerous to kids, because then you don't see as much. You don't see all the work, like Sylvia was saying, that's happening.
I really appreciate the language of expansiveness and the idea that we have to invite teachers to recognize the resources that students are bringing, whether they're linguistic or cultural or intellectual. But the current focus on science of reading is trying to convince us that we've been missing this piece all along. And it's really a lot of the same kind of rhetorical tools that like the diet industry uses. Like, have you been trying to lose weight your whole life? Well, everybody's been lying to you. Let me tell you the real thing. And everybody's excited. I am too. I fall into this trap year after year. Every January when there's new, like, join this gym, do this thing. We fall into this trap, I think, as teachers, because it's a largely kind of female, we will not trust our own judgment, we will not trust our own knowledge, because we're told over and over again in this context, in this country, that that doctors are men, that doctors know best, and that the sciences that are hard sciences or natural sciences, are here to kind of explain these things for us. So I really like the idea of expanding this to be sort of what's known as asset-based, but I think it's even more pointed than that. That it ends up being dehumanizing to focus on phonics as the only possible explanation for reading gaps or for a reading crisis, which is then framed as a whole education system crisis, because people, at least in advocacy materials, move very quickly from difficulty learning to read in first grade to failing scores in third grade to prison. That's the like dot to finish line. And that is dehumanizing immediately, even just in metaphor. But what we're missing as educators, if we only focus on phonics, is tremendous. But also what we're missing as educators who are also human are the opportunities to engage with our students as if they're human and as if they bring sources of knowledge, which I'm excited to hear some more about Courtney's thinking about that.
Yeah, I know, Dr. Hatton, you mentioned in one of your articles that, you just say whose knowledge is really being, whose knowledge matters. So maybe provide a brief overview of those types of knowledge that you feel maybe aren't currently being prioritized in the conversation that we're having about reading instruction.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. So I'm going to actually just put into the chat a Google slide so that you all have sort of a frame of reference as I'm chatting about this. One thing that I do think is important to consider is this idea of like both and. So it's not that like phonics instruction is bad or wrong. It's just that like we need something in addition to some of the, oh, thank you for sending that to all of the attendees instead of just to the panelists. But thinking through sort of how we can expand what we're considering to be knowledge. And I have written quite a bit about sort of this, like whose knowledge matters, whose knowledge is being prioritized, are the curricula that we're using really just only focusing on sort of white heteronormative, predominantly male perspectives, or are we also focusing on some other things as well? But if you check out the Google slides that I just shared, there are some other types of knowledge that I think are sometimes not emphasized quite as much. And so most of my work does focus on comprehension and thinking about within that comprehension realm of there's like this really big emphasis right now on content knowledge. And I think content knowledge is really important and background knowledge is really important. So I don't want to say that that isn't important. I just think that we do need to have a more expansive understanding as to what we mean by knowledge. So some of the different types of knowledge that I think are being de-emphasized right now are things like cultural and linguistic knowledge. I know Sylvia talked a little bit about that earlier. So really understanding the assets that students bring into reading spaces with them. So the experiences that they have, their communities, their language backgrounds, and how we can encourage students to see those to see themselves and to see their experiences as something that's good and not something to be sort of diminished. And then I also talk about principled knowledge. So this is kind of takes content knowledge and like amps it up a little bit. But a lot of times, I think when we think about content knowledge, it's sort of like, okay, what specific topic knowledge does a student need to know in order to understand this text? And instead, I think that we need to consider sort of how knowledge of content are connected to each other. So really deeper conceptual understandings of not only like I'm going to read a text about hurricanes, so I need to know something about hurricanes, but how this text about hurricanes might connect to this other text that I'm reading about like building houses, or this other text that I'm reading that's about something completely different. And rather than sort of having these like random texts that students are reading, building their knowledge through text and then building principled knowledge with that as well. And then also a third one, sorry, there are 6. I'll try to go through these fairly quickly. But the third one is strategic knowledge. And I think that's sort of with this really heavy emphasis on content knowledge right now, which I think is fine. I'm on board with content knowledge again. So this idea of strategy instruction has been diminished, and there are literally decades of work showing the effectiveness of strategy instruction. And I think that strategic knowledge is also really important to think about. So when do I reread a text? When should I summarize? When should I try to tell a friend what I just read, and sort of when should I create something new? When, like, what strategy am I using when? And not just sort of saying like, oh, well, content knowledge is the only thing that we need to do, so we're never going to talk about like being able to get the gist of a text anymore. So again, it's sort of this like both and piece here. And then I also have the fourth one is knowledge of multimodal texts. So understanding that students are reading not only print texts, which I think again is very, very important, but also they're being asked to engage with other types of texts, digital texts, videos, infographics, all sorts of other things. And sort of with that is this idea of multiple text use. So more and more, we're not really ever just reading a single text. If I go online to research something, I'm not going to look at or like, if I want to like figure out where to like take my dog to the vet, I'm not going to just like look at the very first thing. I'm going to go to a bunch of different websites, figure out what the best vet is in town. So we're constantly engaging with multiple texts, and there is some research that sort of shows that younger students aren't particularly great at this, but also that they haven't been taught how to do this. So if we can encourage teachers to help students integrate information across multiple sources, I think that can be really helpful, and show them like there are strategies to being able to integrate this information. And then finally is conditional knowledge. So conditional knowledge is this understanding of when do I use these other types of knowledge? So when do I use my cultural assets? When do I use my language backgrounds, my linguistic backgrounds? When do I reread a text? When do I need to summarize? When do I need to do all of these other things? Yeah, just like this when piece. So these are all these other types of knowledge that I think aren't really being prioritized in current conversations around the science of reading, even though some of them really do have a deep and rich history in literacy research as well. And another one, to be honest, my co-author and I, Dr. Sarah Lupo, and I sort of played around with the possibility of thinking about knowledge of text structure as well. And I do also think that that's really important, but I think it's not something that has been de-emphasized quite as much recently. But I might put in there as well, sort of this understanding, particularly with nonfiction texts, of how different types of text function and what their structures are.
Great, thank you. So in thinking about this within the context of a classroom, we've talked about, a more comprehensive approach to science of reading, what we need to ensure that those things that we are honoring with our students and what they're bringing in to the classroom. If you were to walk into a classroom, what would you really notice if there was a comprehensive approach taking place? What would be some things that you would just make you go home and think that's what that's supposed to look like? Anybody can chime in.
Well, I would hope talking at a very basic level, that there would be some sort of social nature to what was going on, that so I would like to go into a space where there's reading and there's writing and there's talking and there's diverse texts, and on the walls I would hope to see things that I can feel kids, so that the resources and who they are is coming in to that space. I think that it would be like what they're reading, how they're talking, there'd be different modalities, and yeah, you would see engagement. And what it wouldn't look like, wouldn't be So it wouldn't be passive, it wouldn't be isolated, it wouldn't be worksheets, it wouldn't be drill. I mean, I would be able to feel, I mean, like you've watched videos and in some settings, you can feel kids, you can see personalities, and you can feel engagement, and other spaces you don't, you feel task completion. And so I would think the former is what I would feel if something comprehensive was going on.
So you mentioned in the article that you contributed to the special issue, the ILA special issue, reductive and singular models of reading, and how would you describe those characteristics if you had maybe a brand new teacher first year and they were provided curriculum, and if you wanted to say when you want to notice if this is promoting a reductive and singular model of reading, what would be some characteristics that you would describe of that type of model?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reductive would be in the isolated nature of tasks that are being done, so to reduce it to this complex process of reading to figuring out words and getting words right, that feels reductive. And so I think spaces where the model is just on that, where we're instead of engaging on more broad sorts of things, I think that would be how I would go with that.
Yeah, to what both of you have said, I would add wondering and inquiry, because we focus on knowledge and we focus on what people can do, but also what is it that we can learn together. And I think that also requires from teachers to be themselves the ones wondering and the ones coming to assessment and instruction with an inquiry mindset, where you hear kids read and you wonder, what else can explain this? And what can the child explain to me, positioning children as having expertise on their own reading process. So asking questions, because what I often get asked is, well, I'm an outsider to the community. I'm not Latinx, I'm not Mexican. I am not bilingual. I only know English. And I said, but you can wonder with kids. You can, I don't speak all the languages. And we have children who speak many languages and use different writing systems in classrooms. So I have to go into that mindset. So I would say questions in those anchor charts, and the teacher listening to children. I think the talk is that we often go into classrooms and we hear teacher talk, but to hear children talk in this, even in the small group instruction, it's so exhausting for teachers when they're running guided reading or small group instruction. It's a lot of teacher talk, a lot of teacher action. And if can we listen more and ask questions that are genuine about what children are curious about and what children can teach us about their home languages and their practices.
I think that's really powerful, Sylvia, really powerful. I mean, I think, just that simple question of what made you think that, or how did you know, that just can open such great spaces for kids. Yeah.
There's the connection I was halfway to making. Thank you, Mary. The idea of like students bring resources, yes, but they also are resources for each other, and our own inquiry is a resource. And so I think what I'm listening for in a classroom is whether there's evidence of that students are invited to use multiple sources of information, and that they're using them flexibly, and that they're using lots of different kinds, which means on a very basic level that they're reading, writing, and talking about text. So that, I mean, there's that sort of like at minimum, they are reading text that carries meaning, not reading individual words that don't, reading text that carries meaning. They're writing text that carries meaning, not practicing spelling, but not because spelling is unimportant, but because it's unimportant when it's divorced from meaning. It's also unlearnable when it's divorced from meaning, but that's a whole other morphology question. So they're doing some reading, they're doing some writing, and they're doing some talking about text. And if they're doing that, then there's the opportunity for sources of information to be part of those conversations. And the more sources of information students are connected with, whether that's from multiple texts because text is a source, whether it's from paying attention to context because that's a source, or syntax because that's a source, or phonology because that's also a source, it's just one of several, then we know good things are happening. And the last thing that I look for, which is just purely visual, is something Sylvia also mentioned, which is anchor charts, that someone has done something to make the invisible process of reading visible. So when science of reading conversations are focused on being explicit and systematic, there is an explicit systematic version of comprehension and writing instruction, but that's not part of the conversation. And the easiest, fastest most sort of inclusive way of making comprehension and writing explicit and systematic is to make the invisible processes somehow visible by having an anchor chart that says, here's where you begin, or here is a breakdown or a step-by-step of what one of the strategies that you might be thinking about would be, so that it's not out of reach for folks. Because I think, especially with writing, we assume that only competent readers or only competent students have anything to say in writing. And really, we could be assuming actually the opposite, that writing might be the way that you develop your competence. So I see very little writing in general when I go into classrooms, and that would be a great sign just by itself.
Great.
And I think you're touching on the idea of explicit. I think that that's something that like what counts as explicit. I think what we end up saying is what explicit is something that comes in a box and its scope and sequence. And I take issue with that. What's explicit is when you're watching kids and being responsive and have many more things you can see and are explicit about what sort of things you're saying and when and why. That's explicit.
Right.
Right.
Yeah,
You know?
it's about precision.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And if you can see more, then you can be more explicit about what you're responding to. But if you're only seeing this little narrow thing, then, what becomes explicit becomes in a package. Maybe that's too big of a leap, but I think that that's another thing that comes into play, is that teachers don't feel like that they're being direct or specific if they're being responsive. And I think that.
Right. And that relates also to the idea of systematic being only in relation to a schedule created by somebody else. And I think it's Mary Howard who talks about being, I don't think it's her idea alone, but she has been talking about being systematic with relevance to the student. Like, this is systematic for this person. It may not be systematic for your teacher's guide. Like, that scope and sequence fits the individual, not necessarily the curriculum that was designed without them in mind, frankly, without anybody we've ever met in mind, because it was designed before these kids became first graders.
Right. Yep. Okay.
Great. That's a great conversation. We do have a question. The question is, one of the RRQ articles brought up that assessments using cueing systems can bring out contextual knowledge, so the dismissal of miscue analysis in the science of reading conversation is throwing out a valuable set of knowledge about kids' resources. Any further thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is wrapped up in the conversation here about sources of information used, I think. That we have to look for and teach and honor the idea that kids are problem solving and making meaning out of a couple of different things. In the context of the science of reading conversations, there's been a conflation of several different ideas, some of which have evidence and some of which don't. So there's a version of MSV that's sort of like pop psychology, that's like, oh, you should just look at pictures and guess things. And then there's a version of MSV that stands for meaning, syntax, visual, and that is connected to sort of the different language systems, which are connected to sources of information within the written code of English or within language itself. And if we treat those as sources of information, which is how they're used incidentally in running records, if you know what you're up to with those tools. But because the running record shows up as a piece of so many different packages of curriculum with varying levels of guidance and with varying guidance, frankly, a lot of folks are applying kind of a simple version of MSV instead of a complex version of MSV. And in missing in that complexity is the idea that language is a source of information, and the more you know about language, the better a reader you can be. And so if we hadn't conflated those things, the whole idea of miscue analysis wouldn't have been thrown out of the science of reading conversation. But in part because the characters worked out, like in the narrative, the character that was pinned to miscue analysis was Ken Goodman, who is a really interesting and fun guy to follow. And in part because he will say inflammatory things, which is something that like that era of scientists had to do to be relevant, and also a gift that they gave us because it started and prompted and lit up conversations when you would say things not to fit in, but to not fit in on purpose. Now you get followers on Instagram, but 30, 40, 50 years ago, if you wanted to get people's attention, you'd say crazy stuff. And so Ken was opinionated and was polarizing, as were many of his contemporaries. And so it's easy for a reporter now to look back and say, oh, you said all these crazy things, you must be crazy. And so is everything you've ever written. And so in that big one fell swoop, everything was written out of the conversation. But my hope is that we can bring back the conceptual and theoretical knowledge about the complexity of language and reading just by putting it under another name. We're not going to call it music cue analysis anymore. We're just going to call it sources of information used. Thank you.
That's what I've been doing. I haven't in the last couple of years in my teaching. I've stepped away from that, and I've called it sources of knowledge, and actually taken analysis of running record. I have not doing the MSV per se, but looking strategically and to see how are they integrating and in what ways are they using sources instead of categorizing, because that diminishes. And then you have a task of people trying to decide, is that MS or V, instead of people thinking about what is it that children are trying to do to make sense of what they're reading.
I agree. And I want to build on just the work of Ken Goodman and Jetta Goodman in miscue analysis research, because for those of us who work with children who are learning to read in their second language, the decades of research, miscue research following Jetta Goodman's work, and they worked and lived in the borderlands in Tucson, Arizona, where children in schools were using everything they know. And this was before the term translanguaging was coined. But when I went to school in Arizona. So when I first read Jetta Goodman's work, there's a chapter book where she learns from Emilia Ferreiro, who's a very influential Latin American literacy scholar. Her work had great impact on how literacy is taught in Spanish-speaking nations. And the book is called How Children Construct Literacy. And for those of us who know how Spanish literacy works and how, if you look at spelling development across languages, there's just so much richness that this miscue research illuminates beyond MSB. Whereas we have an Oren Goodman's framework, it will be the graphophonic system, syntactic, semantic. There's just more than that. That's just the foundation to look across languages. When a child makes a miscue and the child is still developing their knowledge of how to, the regular past form of a verb, think versus thought. Is that a reading? Can we only explain this through an English decoding lens? And the answer is no, we have to again expand. But this work has been done, and what has just mentioned is just because the people who have the big microphone now haven't read all of this work and this history doesn't mean that it's not there. So for those of us who have been living that reality in the borderlands, in working with children who are always drawing on those two sources of language and that interrelate and interact in complex ways, it's important to bring that back. And now we have new lenses like translanguages that really help us analyze miscues and all the behaviors during oral reading, and think of ways like, can we ask children to analyze them with us? Can we ask them to retell in both of their languages or whatever language makes sense to them? Can they retell using more resources rather than just what follows or traditional running record?
I think you said such a powerful thing, Sylvia, like kids are already doing, like that's what they're doing. So in what ways we choose to see it is, they're drawing on multiple resources, and, can we get on board and see it?
And I think it highlights what you said earlier, is positioning the child as the expert and bringing them in and allowing them and showing what they're able to do. Dr. Hatton, anything you'd like to add to any of that?
I think that I'm trying to, so like running records are not my my bread and butter, I guess you could say, not sort of my area of expertise. And sorry, I'm getting a spam phone call right now, so I'm going to decline that. But I do think that there is something to be said for really needing to help teachers in a very practical way of being able to figure out what's going on. And I do think that sometimes something like miscue analysis or running records can be a little bit confusing, especially for newer teachers, and maybe not the most efficient way of assessing students. So just providing an alternative perspective, I guess. I recently worked with some of my pre-service teachers and sort of introduced them to running records, which they were more familiar with, but then also introduced them to Nell Duke's new like LTR assessment, which is a little bit different. It doesn't focus on MSV analysis. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but my students really preferred the Nell Duke's LTR assessment for a lot of different reasons. But especially because it does provide rich qualitative data, but it also sort of gives teachers an understanding of like what aspects of decoding are our students sort of struggling with a little bit more. So I think it feels more practical to me than a typical miscue analysis or running record. But again, that this isn't my area of expertise, so I don't want to step on anyone's toes or anything like that. But I think that we need to be really careful in terms of like, yes, we want expansiveness in what we're considering to be the science of reading, but we also need to be efficient for teachers in the way that we're communicating with them.
I think you're hitting on an important thing here, which Mary got to with her sort of focus on the strategic activity or the strategic actions kids are taking when they're doing those running records. And also the idea that like, just like everybody's got their own version of what counts as the science of reading, and some people have a really narrow idea of what that is and how you do it, and some people have a really broad one. Same thing is true of running records. Same thing is true of miscue analysis. And there are folks that have been, that I appreciate that Nell Duke is sort of repopularizing something that people have been doing forever, which is just focusing on the strategic activity, like what Mary was talking about in her own work. And what I think people do kind of in and out when they understand the tools that they have and how to use them strategically. So again, when we're like, we want teachers to be paying attention to the sources of information that kids are using to make meaning out of text at every level. And this is where the conversation can get beyond third grade and can get beyond sort of beginning reading or emerging readers and stuff. But like, how are you figuring out what this means, and how are you figuring out how to mean something to somebody else when you put things into writing in various modalities. But same thing for teachers. We want them to have lots of different sources of information that they can use efficiently to understand their readers, so that they don't rely only on one source all the time, which I think is where Sylvia started with. Like, if we only give them information about, if all we've given them is an oral reading fluency score, that's not a rich enough source of information to make a good instructional decision. Similarly, if we give them like 8 million different data points, that it's too much information. I can't be strategic about that. So I think part of the science of reading is figuring out the profiles of information that teachers can learn enough about to use well. Because when you know how to use your assessment well, you can use it strategically. And when you don't, you can't. And it either isn't enough or it's too much. But that not enoughness, too muchness syndrome follows every single assessment that exists. And it really has to do with the user's own knowledge that they bring to it, as if the assessment is a text itself.
Just as kids are drawing from the tools that they need and the flexibility with which they need it, that's the teachers that are positioned in the similar sorts of ways. What sorts of things are they looking for and why?
Yeah, so I think this kind of ties into teacher expertise and thinking about, we know that, there's this multi-dimensional, very highly complex process that we call reading. And if we think about it, we know it's complex, it's multi-dimensional. We know it's an experience that our readers have. would you say there are certain core categories of these teaching expertise or teaching strategies, if you will, that should be considered sort of just the foundational things that we would like for teachers to receive in either teacher education programs or professional development programs? I think I had Dr. Gay with that question, but
Well, I think you somehow have to see it as this journey, right? I think that there are, early on, different things that we're putting focus. Kids need to move from this oral world to the print world. So there's all, what print is speech captured. And so there's that whole journey of helping kids to realize that what I say carries meaning, but its sounds can also be captured and matched. So foundational sorts of things about, what print is and what written language is and how that relates to the oral world that we live in. And then, I think, and then it becomes more complex as we go on. So I think part of the thing for me is that I value is that it's this journey of change. It's always decoding and meaning making, but the ways in which that decoding and meaning making are interacting, it changes over time and changes across contexts. So.
Anybody else want to add?
It's a really good question because it's a really hard question. So thanks for that. I've been thinking a lot more about what secondary teachers need to know about literacy and more recently. So I'm going to talk about, she thinks I should talk more about elementary, but anyway, I'm going to talk about that just for a moment, and maybe somebody can make a bridge if there's one worth making. But I've been thinking a lot about the need for folks to think about the text as just all different kinds of text, multimodal text and talk as text, and all of those as like systems of representation. And so that like kids have access to join the conversation, that their discipline is or not even like discipline's often too big, but that the content that they're talking about, whenever it becomes useful in the world, it's in some sort of community, and you need certain ways of communicating to be in that community. And so the more content area teachers can help students notice, like just become aware, and then find patterns in the way that language is being used to talk about certain things, the more they'll be able to participate as language users, either oral or written or symbolic or any other, in order to figure out how to fully participate in using that knowledge to do something in the world. That's a little bit abstract, thinking about what that means for like someone who's just developing literacy skills. But when I think about what kids are learning in their content area classes, they're not learning stuff for like, what's that game that you play, Trivial Pursuit. They're not learning like item knowledge that will show up again on a game show. They might be learning processes, they might be learning strategies, they might just be learning what people call how to think, which I'm still not entirely sure what that means, or like why we would assume that kids don't know how to do it, but because they showed up, right? But they are learning how to participate in using that knowledge to do something. And I think the same thing probably is true for little kids, that we need to help them participate in the community of people that use print to do stuff in the world, which means, yeah, they need to be able to like do stuff with their print knowledge, read things that matter to them, write things that matter to them, and have them get delivered to an audience. The same way that we don't want people to just memorize biology facts in 9th grade. We want them to be reading and talking and writing biologies so that they can, that's not a real thing, but so that they can use biology to do something that matters to them.
We have a question for Dr. Nguyen-Liu, and then I want to get back to Dr. Hatton with a question about the cognitive processes that you also say are important. We know the sociocultural part and the knowledge bringing in, and then we want to talk a little bit about that as well, because you have some really great points on that. The question for Dr. Nguyen-Liu: I remember that you mentioned the merits of including translanguaging practices in the classroom, but you also admitted that it would not be possible that the teacher speaks all the languages that his students bring to the school. What is your suggestion for the teachers who are monolingual and haven't been exposed to diverse cultures? but want to provide time and space for translanguaging in their classroom?
Thank you. And I typed the answer, so I think you moved to the
Oh,
middle.
you did? Oh, I'm
Yes.
sorry.
But I can just say quickly, I mean, small moments as building blocks of modeling that inquiry mindset, because you may have multiple languages in that classroom and you want to just like you think aloud when you're modeling a comprehension strategy, you can also think aloud, oh, I wonder what that word means. Or I wonder how that sound, if there's a similar sound in Spanish, like this one. Or I know that in Spanish, you say a, e, I, o, u, like building blocks, small things that can, but I think the modeling of that, I'm wondering, it's key. And using the resources in the building and in the community in a reasonable sense, because I think one of the questions you asked was how we don't add the labor or push the labor to the community and the families, but using what's in the building.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I'm not monitoring the chat room, so I didn't realize you'd already, but I know that you did mention you were going to answer in the chat if a question came up for you, so great. Okay, so Dr. Hatton, you mentioned the three specific cognitive processes important for text comprehension. I know a lot of your work is in the reading comprehension. So if you can describe the concept of relational reasoning prompts and refutation texts, and then maybe discuss the teacher's role in facilitating these types of activities without privileging that the dominant worldview that we often see in texts and classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to do that. Again, I'm just going to share out, hopefully this time to panelists and attendees, the Google Doc again, because just in case some people may have lost it. But I want to take a step back and just make sure that we're all on the same page with the different cognitive processes that I talk about. So in this RQ article, Sarah and I talk about knowledge activation, knowledge integration, and knowledge revision. And knowledge activation, I think a lot of times is very narrowly thought about as like topic knowledge activation before I read a text. And instead, I think, there's lots of research that shows that knowledge activation should happen throughout text processing, so before, during, and after, and that we need to privilege all of the different knowledges and experiences that students have as they're working to grapple with and understand text. So that's what I mean by knowledge activation, rather than sort of a more narrow view of sort of like a KWL chart. When we're thinking about knowledge integration, this is sort of, we all have knowledge gaps in our knowledge or pieces that are sort of missing. So how can what I read sort of help fill in some of those pieces or the puzzle pieces that I don't know about a particular text or content or whatever it is that I'm reading. And then knowledge revision is something that I would argue is not always appropriate, but is sometimes very important. And knowledge revision is like, when I'm reading a text, is what's in the text actually contradictory to what I think I already know, to the naive perceptions or just vast misconceptions that I have. And if it is, maybe I do need to change what I know, change my schemata in order to adjust to what is quote unquote true. But what I'm thinking about here is this is mostly appropriate in thinking about like knowledge about like vaccines or climate change, or like these really evidence-based in a different type of way than we might think about it within the literacy context. But there's this large body of evidence about like climate change. So maybe if you don't believe in climate change, we should be trying to help revise your knowledge about this. Or if you don't believe that vaccines are going to be beneficial, let's try to help revise your knowledge about this. So that's sort of what I mean by knowledge revision. So with that, I want to talk about refutation texts first, and then I'll talk a little bit about relational reasoning. But refutation texts really are most beneficial when we have a common, deeply held misconception. So again, talking about like learning styles or vaccines or whatever else we might want to be throwing out there. And they are most typically used in science classrooms rather than in literacy contexts. But again, I think that this can be helpful for any when we're reading any sort of text. but refutation texts are not good for like sort of these in the moment misunderstandings. So it has to be like this deeply held misunderstanding, because you're reading a text and the text has to be there to help sort of facilitate this knowledge revision process. And within that, I want to just provide an example of sort of the steps that a refutation text might take, which is on the blue slide. But the first would be you state the misconception. So for example, and this example is coming from a Duffin 2020 article in Psychology Today, which is, you may think that aligning instruction to learning styles results in optimal learning, and then you would refute the misconception, which is this belief is not correct, and then explain the scientifically valid position of numerous studies have found no improved learning outcomes when instruction method was matched to learning styles. So this is something that I use in my undergraduate classes, but you can sort of see how this could be useful also for younger students. And sort of the evidence base for this is that, for example, there was a study that was conducted by Broughton, Sinatra, and Nussbaum, and it came out in 2013 that talks about students' understanding of Pluto. So they used a refutation text to help students understand why Pluto was no longer classified as a planet. So this knowledge revision process happening through a very purposeful text that you might be providing for students. And there's also, I want to mention, there's also Sinatra and Broughton in 2011 have an article in RRQ that sort of summarizes a lot of the research that is at the intersection between reading comprehension and conceptual change. My concerns with refutation texts are that they aren't particularly feasible. And in fact, back in December, I attended a session at LRA, and I can't remember who the presenters were, so I should have written this down. But there were some people who did some work looking at the science texts that are used in elementary classrooms, and very, very few refutation texts exist. So it's a great resource, but we just don't have a lot of refutation texts, and therefore the feasibility of having students use them or having teachers use them is kind of like, does this actually work? We don't necessarily want to put additional work on teachers in terms of trying to create refutation texts based off of a deeply held misconception. And again, this really only works with those like big misconceptions. So those are sort of some of my issues with refutation texts and the refutation text literature. But I think another thing to think about is this idea of relational reasoning, which I think helps get to this idea of like how to not then privilege the dominant worldview a little bit more. So it's this cognitive ed psych idea, but that sort of can sort of seep into these other things. And relational reasoning, kind of similar to what Rachel was talking about in terms of looking at patterns, is really the ability to see patterns and within the whatever streams of information are coming at you. And my former advisor, Dr. Patricia Alexander, sort of introduced 4 different forms of relational reasoning. So there are analogical reasoning, which has been studied extensively, and anomalous reasoning, antinomous reasoning, and then antithetical reasoning. So I provide some questions here to help students. And again, I use this work as a knowledge activation technique, but when we're thinking about knowledge activation, I would encourage relational reasoning to happen before and during reading, and then also after reading. But when we're thinking about analogies, the questions that I would ask is sort of like, how is what's in this text similar to what I already know? So this is very similar to like a very typical knowledge activation, like, what do I already know about this? But with the idea of also encouraging students to think beyond only topic specific knowledge. So anything that I've heard or experience in school or out of school. Anomaly questions, which would be sort of like what in this text is unusual or surprising. Antinomy questions, an example of that could be what about this text could never be seen, read, or heard today. So there's actually a conflict here. And I like this particularly for like history texts or historical fiction or science fiction, when we're thinking about like what's in the text actually, like that's so different than what I'm experiencing today. It just doesn't work. And then antithetical questions are what I'm reading is actually the opposite of what I know or think. And this kind of allows students to grapple with their misunderstandings or to even think through like, actually what's in this text, I don't believe it and I don't trust it, and sort of consider the source of the knowledge or the authority and whether or not I trust this authority. And if I don't trust that authority, then I'm not going to revise my knowledge, but sort of really positing or positioning like what I know in comparison to what I'm reading, but not only doing this in terms of similarity, but thinking about all these other ways that what we're reading could relate to what we think we already know. I don't know if that sort of answered your question. That was very long-winded. I apologize again.
Fine, thank you. Okay, so we have another question from the audience. This is not to anybody specific, it's for everyone. There is a debate on whether children should be taught to use context, for example, pictures, to identify the written words. Some argue if a child is taught using pictures to identify words, they are taught to read as a poor reader. Others believe pictures help struggling readers to decode unfamiliar words and contribute to children's reading comprehension. What are your thoughts about the effect of pictures illustrations on learning to read and their role in reading instruction?
Well, I think that pictures are part of the experience. So, I mean, like that just kind of goes to what we've been talking about this afternoon in terms of all sorts of resources that are available and that children are using all the resources. I think that what maybe has happened in society is we think that it's just one, like we can't use pictures because then that will deter or detract, or if kids are using pictures, they're not using letters and sounds. That's false. It's both. So we want kids to be gleaning from pictures and from story, and then to also be checking and looking at letters and developing their phonics. And I think that goes to my earlier idea that it's developmental over time. So in part of their journey, there's going to be more reliance on pictures, and that's okay because they need that sort of, strong support so they can use that cognitive energy for the phonics part. And then as that becomes strengthened, then they can, so it's always both. So I don't be covering up pictures for kids. They need all of the things.
And don't be covering up words. I think,
it's
like, don't cover because
yes, let all of the sources come to you.
Right. I mean, this really connects with the idea of like all of the different sources and all of the resources that students bring, but also what Courtney was saying about all of the sources of information within the text that they're engaging with and all the different things, all the different ways of knowing and things you can know from looking at text. If we zoom out and think and ask the question about readers in general, so including my 3-year-old who's an emergent reader, and including a high school student or a college student or a doctoral student, and ask the question, should we allow readers to use pictures? It's a silly question. Can you imagine like telling the science textbook to not print any pictures? Like that, you wouldn't do that because some ideas are represented in images better, more efficiently, with greater detail and greater conceptual accuracy than language ever could. And similarly, depending on how you approach text and what you know about print already, my 3-year-old's looking only at the pictures. So like, I'm
that's
glad
fine.
they're there. Otherwise, it would just be oral storytelling to her until there is a match. So I think the idea of like one and not the other is is the same kind of scared, defensive, lack of information that also supports like English only, like you're not going to learn, or that even, yeah, or spoken language only. You're not going to learn to read unless you only are exposed to spoken language, or you're not going to learn to talk if I also sign to you as a child. But like we actually have evidence of the total opposite. So over and over again across domains and across fields. So if there's a signal system, a system of representation, a communication system, a source of information, we shouldn't be cutting them off, but we should be valuing them. And part of valuing them is giving them their due. And I think where people are coming from when they say like, we shouldn't let kids look at the picture because then they just guess the word, is that we have the fear is that people won't give print its due, which is a strange fear because culturally and historically print is hegemonic. And so that's weird, but also it's an area where some people struggle or take longer. I want to say take longer is even more common than struggle, but take longer than expected or struggle with acquisition of fluent reading. And so there's a great deal of anxiety and interest in making sure that people do develop fluent word reading skills. And if anything is going to detract from that, there's a great deal of anxiety around it. But again, if you zoom out, it's not a real quandary in terms of reading. It's a real quandary in terms of the pedagogy of a small moment in reading development.
Thank you so much, Mary and Rachel. I feel a lot better hearing you say that. I have a lot of answers for this question because I get this question a lot. And part of it is when it becomes an all the time, should we never use pictures for all kids versus there's this very specific instance when a child, and this comes from the Hanford documentary, one of many, that they're looking at a predictable text, a text with a predictable pattern that is designed in a way that the text matches the image. Exactly. So if the cat is running and the picture has a cat running, turn the page, the cat is jumping. And part of the answer is, well, that book serves a purpose. So if you have read Brown Bear with a child, you know what that does and what work it does. It builds an oral language and helps them track the print, learn one-on-one correspondence. If you have read Brown Bear with an emergent bilingual student, then that book does a lot of work for you because you can introduce vocabulary that is represented in the image. So it's more of like looking at specific examples. And I posted one of the readings because part of the challenge in having these conversations with schools and districts is to use the same frames they're using to say, well, if you look at Lini Aris spelling developmental stages, children in kindergarten and first grade are at this partial cue reading stage when they don't have yet, they cannot decode all the words in all the books. So developmentally, they need those pictures to be able to succeed at reading independently. So I have, I guess, gathered a source of resources that are cited by proponents of the science of reading that they'll give me evidence that this is okay, that it's okay to do a picture walk. It serves a purpose, but that's not everything you do. And the other answer would be that multimodal visual literacy, like we're always making meaning across resources. And again, for emergent bilinguals, that is a key teaching tool to go back and revisit that picture and say, let's look at this vocabulary word. Let's look at the picture. Okay, what is the meaning of this word? Well, I can learn. Here's an example. So we cannot take away a teaching resource from a group of learners.
I think that we hear that term evidence-based a lot. Even I remember even as a classroom teacher hearing, oh, well, this is evidence-based, this is evidence-based. When we hear those terms, when talking about curriculum and instruction, what should be, just for, a classroom teacher, what should be maybe some cautions, if you will? Like if I hear evidence-based, am I, to not taking that as face value, but really digging in and determining and giving some of the empowerment to the teacher in thinking about what they're using and whether or not they want to use it.
I think you pointed us in a great direction there with inviting teachers to consider the evidence instead of taking the evidence at face value. So that's a piece of it. And I think short of having your own personal statistician, don't you wish you had your own personal statistician at all times? Short of having your own personal like stats department at your disposal for all of the questions that you have about like what's on sale at what supermarket, and also who's going to win the Super Bowl, and also short of that, folks often, and myself included, don't feel like we have the knowledge or the authority or the time to make an informed decision about things. And so sometimes we take evidence-based like, oh, good, someone made the decision for me. But what we should feel invited to do is say, okay, somebody else has already decided, has someone had a good experience with this before when they were studying it systematically. And it's my job to now study it systematically in my own context and see if it bears fruit. And I've been using that metaphor of fruitfulness, and like, so I'm going to plant this in the soil that I know and see how it grows. And if it doesn't grow well, that's not necessarily about the soil. It's not necessarily about the seed. Bless you. It might just be the match between the soil and the seed. And so, and I don't need to be a statistician to know whether something is fruitful, whether there is a good outcome, whether it was generative, whether things are better now than they were before. It can be that simple and that holistic. But nothing evidence-based is foolproof. It just means that there is some indication of goodness here. And could that goodness translate is your question. Something that doesn't have evidence is not necessarily bad. It just means that there is no existing indication of goodness yet. So it's the same question. Like if you thought of it, or if it has an evidence-based sticker on it, it's really the same task for you as a practitioner. You're going to plant this in the soil that you've been tending, that you've been putting good things into, that you've been watching very carefully, and you're going to see if it bears fruit. And if it doesn't, it's really okay to feed that back into the research process and say, not here, not under these circumstances.
So would you say it's important for teachers to also see themselves as the researchers?
Yeah, like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think but yeah, and then the research that involves all the parts, right? So it's what's the seed and what's the soil and what's so it's the whole triad. It's what's the text's role, what text are we making available, what's my teacher, what am I saying, why am I saying it, and the child. So it's not just in them, it's all. So you're looking at all those things. And if something doesn't feel right, or if the child doesn't seem to be growing as much, using Rachel's analogy, then let's look at all the parts.
And I think that also supports what Dr. Nguyen-Liu was saying, is that the teacher is in a constant active inquiry themselves. We want our students to be inquirers, but we also need to stay as inquirers as well. Great. So Dr. Gabriel, I know you have some expertise in educational policy. So what role do you say literacy organizations and legislators play in how teachers support children on their literacy journey?
I'm going to separate those if that's okay. So literacy organizations, I think the role of the professional organizations is to connect the professionals and to create conditions for responsible grappling with issues. Not so much to come out with the answers, not so much to say this is what we believe and what we don't believe, but to connect the professionals with the existing resources, like the knowledge in the field, which is why you often see professional organizations hosting conferences and publishing journals, but also with the human resources in the field to create possibilities for people to connect with one another. And to help us gather in ways that are generative. And more often, I'm finding that conferences are not super generative. They are information sharing events sometimes, but it's not always the most efficient way to even share that information. So I often wish that I could have just read everybody's paper instead of sitting through like 90 minutes of them talking about their paper, but then gotten to talk to them, you know. So I think that there is really a lot of room for different formats of conferences. And I got an amen on that. So I want everybody to note it. So I think professional organizations have that role. Pacifier slip. And number two, the policymakers. So interestingly, I'm finding out more and more that the folks that are voting on it, our elected officials, are often not exactly the people that draft the policy. And it's the nitty gritty word by word changes that people make that really shift what the possibilities are. And so it's their responsibility the policymakers have to listen to their constituents. The constituents need to look carefully at the wording, and they need to do the talking with their policymakers. But more often than not, it's advocates or staffers or both that are crafting the actual language of the policy that matters. And it sometimes is just a matter of a word or a couple of words that end up making a difference in what is allowable or not allowable.
Thank you. Okay, we have an.
Oh, yay, there we go.
Yeah, that's better.
Yay.
Wanted to join in.
Oh, baby.
She had her favorite things in her little pack and play, but I think she's done with independent play.
Yeah.
There you go.
Thank you for your patience.
No
There you
problem.
go. She's
Okay, we have another question from the audience. Beers and Probst suggests the question, what challenged, changed, or confirmed my thinking to help build students' comprehension of nonfiction? I'm curious about your responses to this question relative to the science of reading. What about the recent conversations around the science of reading have challenged, changed, or confirmed your thinking about reading instruction and assessment?
I can connect that question to, I guess, one of the questions that you posed about what's keeping you up at night thinking, like with all of the things that we are in charge of as literacy faculty in universities, is that we have to continue reading and learning. I feel like I have learned a lot in the last 12 years and last 2 years and expanded my own thinking, reading across traditions, always with the lens of there's value in everything, there's value in every tradition, there's also limitations, and that everybody in this conversation needs to be humble with the limitations of our own understandings. Like, I can learn about foundational skills, I can listen, I can talk to people also, but also acknowledging that there's a history of certain disciplines and certain types of knowledge being marginalized, and also trying to advocate in a way that is solution oriented and children oriented. That in the end, everybody sitting in this table wants to help children, hopefully.
Any other additional comments?
I think I really agree. It's been both humbling and exciting. It wasn't a warm and fuzzy invitation to revisit what you know and why you know it, and also what you don't know and how you might come to learn it. But it was a very much a needed conversation, at least for me and from my perspective, the perspective that I came from, which, because I was often surrounded by other researchers who agreed with me, which I think is also just a feature of your development. You are much like a musician, you get sort of raised in a studio, right? Like you get raised in as an intellectual within a certain community at your university under your advisor and other people that they have advised. And so you end up there, the sort of insulated nature, which is another thing professional organizations are helpful in kind of mediating. But there is an insulated nature to things. And there are things that I didn't even realize needed defense or evidence, because I just took them as like taken for granted. Obviously, everybody knows that and thinks that, right? And we've had this wonderful wonderful, awful, wonderful experience as literacy researchers of having our community in the spotlight of in the media spotlight and the policy spotlight at the same time over time. And not everybody gets to do that in their disciplinary intellectual growth. And we've had to answer for things that most folks don't ever have to consider or answer for. And we've had to consider other possibilities. And so in a weird way, I mean, I've had several just in passing conversations with Emily Hanford, and when it, you know, sometimes I've been frustrated with her reporting and have thought like, oh, if I could just talk to her, I would say. But when I've come face to face with her, I've almost always said thank you, not because I think that her suggestion for how we should move forward should make its way into policy, but because it has sparked and evoked conversations and confirmation of things that I think have been very important, and also have clarified for me like what is worth fighting for and isn't, what we do have evidence for and what we don't, and what the most important questions might be, whether they're the ones I'm the most interested in answering or not. And that's another place where I think our field has been pushed, because we've been in the public eye and the policy eye at the same time for a long time, is to really figure out what the priority should be for kids that are going to school in the US these days, not necessarily the sort of our most interesting intellectual curiosity or our most fundable even intellectual curiosity.
Anybody else? Challenge, change?
Yeah, I think it's been, like, just to piggyback on what Ray, I mean, I think it's been challenging, and it's kind of like you grow from tension, you grow when you're uncomfortable kind of thing, you know? So I was sort of angry and bothered, but then now I'm like grateful, like, okay, because I have just taken in so much and grown so much because of this instigation that I felt. So I think it's that, you know, it was challenging and confirming together and growing. I mean, so like my palette grew. So I think that, you know, it's all of it wrapped together.
Are you seeing similarities, even though we're maybe talking about different fields, different ways of conducting research? Has the opportunity allowed you to see that there maybe are more similarities than differences, or do you still have concerns that really do keep you up at night about possible boundaries that are still in place?
I can try to answer that. I think, and maybe it's because of the nature of the work that I do, I really try to seek out the similarities, but knowledge is so broad that it's a little bit easier to do that with something like knowledge rather than learning how to decode text. So at least in my opinion or in my experiences, but I think that there are places of consensus and places where we can sort of come to sort of general understandings, but when we get to the nitty-gritty of how things are done, there are some pretty big and stark differences, and I think that that's okay. I think of when it isn't okay is when we do stay sort of in our silos. And I know Rachel mentioned, like, at literacy or at professional conferences, there is an opportunity to speak across those silos, but I think that doesn't even happen very much. Like I think a lot of times we go to the people we know, like we go to hear presenters that we know, we go to hear them sort of confirm our beliefs and confirm our biases, rather than going to sessions that we might feel uncomfortable in, or that might provide a different perspective. And that's something that I've been trying to go when I go to conferences. I try to go to sessions that might be different from what might be sort of my like like confirming my own beliefs or my own biases. But I think that that's something that as researchers we can do, but also speaking across these silos, like Rachel was saying, like speaking to Emily Hanford and talking to her, or speaking to people who come from other perspectives. And I think we probably have differences within like the four of us who are talking here right now, but still like being able to talk to each other in a respectful way. Because I think things get so heated because it's like, but children need to learn how to read, and like, yes, this is very important, but we also need to be respectful in our disagreements. I think that's sort of what ends up keeping me up at night, is sort of these like very heated conversations that end up happening that don't lead us somewhere, or just very surface level conversations that also don't lead us anywhere. So how can we sort of talk across each other in a respectful way to do what's best for kids?
So I think we have about 2 minutes left. So I wanted to see if maybe we could just kind of wrap up, since we've got, a large field of teachers out there doing this work day in and day out. And of course, the past year has been, quite challenging. So maybe we could end with just a word of encouragement for the teachers, and just for maybe things just to, as you move forward and think about these things, and as the science of reading conversation kind of becomes maybe more infiltrated into curriculum and things like that, what would be your last sort of send off to classroom teachers?
I would say thank you. To be an elementary school teacher during this year, it was just a yeoman's task. And I guess, I think to trust, we know kids, we know our, I think that you're doing formidable and good work. And I think, don't diminish what you know and who you are in those relationship with kids because somebody says the word science. So I think that would be my short thing.
Great, thanks. Anyone else?
Go ahead.
I was hoping you would go. I think, Lacey, I think that we've seen this before with teacher prep programs when there was a big schism in how we should prepare teachers, and then programs started to look more and more like each other, this institutional isomorphism. It's already happening in the packaged programs. Teachers College added a phonics piece, and Wilson has added more comprehension. Like we are going to see this, the materials are going to start kind of finding each other's in some sort of murky middle. And as that happens, what I hope teachers are holding on to is the idea that people are not looking out for your humanity as an intellectual or a professional, and you have a right to look out for it yourself, because the breadth and the health of your humanity as a leader of a classroom is directly related to the health of the humanity of your children. And not all of the ways of teaching literacy in the US today are humanizing. And some of them, since some of them are not, you need to be whole so that you can make sure that you are not cutting off pieces of the kids that are sitting in front of you by forcing them into ways of teaching and learning that don't honor who they are as people. So you have a right to your own humanity, and you have a right to protect the humanity of your children. And there are people who want to help you in that work. And sometimes they're called researchers, but not always.
Yeah, I would also say thank you, and don't do this alone. There's a lot of power in community, in your building, across the children and families you work with, and many of us who I love working with, or master students or pre-service teachers. There's just a lot of power in coming together and talking.
Dr. Hatton?
I think I already said sort of my final piece, so I feel like I'm at a loss for words a little bit. But yes, thanking teachers and maybe empowering teachers to feel as though that they can be critical of curricula and they can be critical of the text that they're putting in front of students, and trusting yourself a little bit and making those decisions as the instructional leader in your own classroom.
All right, well, we appreciate this conversation. It's been very informative, and we feel very honored to have all of you with us for an hour and a half. But we just want to say thank you again, and hopefully I apologize to any questions we didn't get through in the chat room, but appreciate each of you and hope you have a great end of the semester. And for our attendees, I hope that you can take what was said here and apply it in your area of work. And I appreciate you attending.
And thank you very much to Tyran and Lacey for a job and a panel. Well done. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Rock on. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, panelists. Good seeing y'all.
Good seeing you.
Whoop,
Good
whoop.
to see you too. Thanks, interpreters.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
Thank you, interpreters. Excellent.